Imagine standing on a vast, windswept plain somewhere between the Caspian Sea and the Great Wall of China. The ground beneath your feet is dry and cracked, baked by a sun that shows no mercy. And then you hear it. Not a sound, exactly, more of a feeling. A trembling deep in the earth, like the heartbeat of something ancient and enormous waking up. You look to the horizon and see nothing. Just flat, endless steps stretching in every direction. But the ground keeps shaking. And then they appear. First as a dark smudge on the edge of the world. Then as a line. Then as a wall. A living, breathing wall of horses and men that stretches as far as your eyes can reach in either direction. There are thousands of them. Tens of thousands. They ride in near silence, with no war cries, no beating drums, no flags snapping in the wind. Just the thunder of hooves and the low, constant rumble that has been rattling the bones of an entire continent for over 2 centuries. These are the Mongol warriors, the most feared fighting force in human history. And before this day is done, cities will burn, kingdoms will fall, and the world will never, ever be the same again. Welcome. What you are about to hear is not just a collection of historical trivia. It is the story of how a small group of nomadic people from the frozen grasslands of Central Asia built the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen. It is the story of a leader so brilliant, so ruthless, and so visionary that historians still argue about whether he was the greatest conqueror of all time or something far more complicated than that. It is the story of warriors who rode harder, fought smarter, and endured more suffering than almost any fighting force before or since. These are their secrets, their tactics, their lives, their world. 100 facts that will change the way you see the Mongol Empire forever. There is a moment in history when the world holds its breath, when a force so new, so radical, and so terrifyingly effective arrives on the scene that everything that came before it suddenly seems fragile and naive. The Mongol warriors were that force. And it all begins with a man born into nothing, on a stretch of frozen Mongolian steppe, sometime around the year 1162. The child who would one day be called Genghis Khan was born holding a blood clot the size of a knuckle in his fist, an omen, his people believed, of a great warrior yet to come. His birth name was Temujin, meaning of iron, or blacksmith, and from the very first moment of his life, the universe seemed to be building him towards something immense. He was born into a world of almost constant tribal warfare, where alliances shifted like sand, where your neighbor could be your murderer by next winter, and where survival itself was a daily act of extraordinary willpower. The steppe was not just a geographic location. It was a crucible, and Temujin was the metal being hammered into shape inside it. The Mongol warrior was not born into comfort. He was born into the saddle, quite literally. Children on the Mongolian steppe were placed on horseback before they could walk with confidence, and by the age of 3, a Mongol child was expected to begin learning to ride without assistance. By the time a boy reached the age of 5, he was already practicing archery from the back of a moving horse, a skill that would define his entire life and the fate of empires. This was not cruelty or hardship in the traditional sense, it was simply the world they inhabited. The steppe demanded total mastery of the horse, because without it, you could not hunt, you could not travel, you could not survive the brutal winters or the merciless summers. The result of this childhood immersion in horsemanship was a generation of warriors who could ride with a precision and endurance that astonished every enemy they ever faced. European knights, Persian cavalrymen, Chinese soldiers, all of them were skilled riders. But none of them had grown up the way Mongol warriors did, fused to their horses from infancy, reading the animals' movements with their bodies rather than their minds. What made the Mongol army truly revolutionary was not any single weapon or tactic, it was the philosophy that bound it all together. Genghis Khan created something that had never existed before on the steppe, a unified, disciplined, and deeply organized military machine drawn from dozens of formerly warring tribes. He abolished the old clan-based system of loyalty and replaced it with something far more powerful: loyalty to the army itself and to him. Soldiers were organized into units of 10, called arban, which were then grouped into hundreds, called zun, then thousands, called minghan, and finally tens of thousands, called tuman. This decimal system of organization was not simply an administrative convenience. It was a revolutionary restructuring of Mongol society that ensured every warrior knew exactly who he answered to, exactly what was expected of him, and exactly what the consequences of failure would be. The system was so efficient that a Mongol general could communicate a change of tactics across a battlefield of 100,000 warriors in minutes, using nothing more than flags, drums, and smoke signals. The bow was the soul of the Mongol warrior, not the short, straight bows used by European archers or the long bows of the English yeoman, but a composite recurve bow of extraordinary complexity and power, a weapon that had taken centuries of steppe engineering to perfect. The Mongol bow was constructed from layers of horn, sinew, and wood, each material chosen for its specific mechanical properties and bonded together under carefully controlled conditions. The result was a bow that was short enough to be used from horseback, sometimes no more than 4 feet in length, but capable of driving an arrow with enough force to penetrate the armor of a fully equipped knight at distances of up to 300 meters. To put that in perspective, the English longbow, widely considered one of history's great weapons, had an effective range of roughly 250 meters against unarmored targets. The Mongol composite bow consistently outranged it and did so from the back of a galloping horse. A skilled Mongol archer could loose between 6 and 12 arrows per minute, and every warrior carried at least 60 arrows in 2 quivers, enough ammunition for a sustained engagement without resupply. But here is where things take an unexpected turn. The Mongol warrior did not simply point and shoot. He trained obsessively in a technique that modern archers still study and debate today: the ability to release an arrow at the precise moment in a horse's stride when all 4 hooves are off the ground. This fraction of a second, lasting only about a third of a heartbeat, is the only moment when the vibration of the horse's body does not interfere with the arrow's flight path. Hitting that window consistently at full gallop under combat conditions, while also steering the horse, reading the battlefield, and staying alive, required years of practice and a degree of physical and mental coordination that borders on the superhuman. Mongol warriors trained this skill every single day from childhood. And they did not just shoot forward. They were equally deadly, firing backward over the horse's rump while in full retreat, a maneuver so disorienting for their enemies that it appeared almost magical. The Parthian shot, as it came to be known in the ancient world, was perfected to a lethal art by the Mongol archer. The Mongol diet was one of the strangest and most practical in the ancient world, and understanding it helps explain how these warriors could operate at distances and speeds that their enemies thought physically impossible. On campaign, a Mongol warrior's primary food source was his horse, not the meat of a dead horse, but the blood and milk of a living one. Horse milk, fermented into a mildly alcoholic drink called arag, was consumed daily and provided calories, protein, probiotics, and hydration in a single portable container that renewed itself daily as long as the horse lived. Blood could be taken from a living horse by opening a small vein in the neck, collecting a measured amount, and then sealing the wound, a technique that kept the horse functional while feeding the warrior. Dried meat, called borts, was another crucial ration. Strips of meat were dried in the sun and wind until they resembled hard, dark wood, then ground into powder. A single kilogram of borts could feed a warrior for weeks when reconstituted with water or simply chewed as is. These food technologies gave Mongol armies an operational range that no other military force of the era could match. The Mongol Empire's speed of movement was, and remains, one of the great logistical miracles of military history. The Mongol army covered distances so vast and so quickly that it fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. During the campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219 and 1220, Mongol forces covering hundreds of miles arrived at enemy cities before word of their approach could travel by conventional messenger. They moved faster than information itself. The secret was a combination of factors working in perfect concert: the extraordinary endurance of the Mongolian steppe horse, the minimalist supply chain of the Mongol warrior, the use of multiple remounts for each rider, and a level of physical conditioning in both horse and human that had no parallel in the medieval world. Each Mongol warrior typically rode with between 3 and 5 horses, rotating between them throughout the day to prevent exhaustion. This meant that while an enemy cavalry force might cover 30 miles in a single day, a Mongol force could cover 60, 70, or even more day after day, without stopping. The Mongolian horse itself deserves recognition as one of the great secret weapons of the empire. Standing only about 13 to 14 hands high, significantly smaller than the European war horses of the Middle Ages, the Mongolian horse appeared at first glance to be almost laughably inadequate for war. European observers routinely underestimated it. They were used to the great destriers of medieval chivalry, massive, powerful animals bred for the shock of cavalry charge. But the Mongolian horse had qualities that no European breed could match: an almost supernatural endurance, the ability to survive on sparse winter pasture that would kill a larger animal, resistance to cold that allowed it to function in conditions that turned European horses into immobile, shivering liabilities, and a sure-footedness on difficult terrain that made it essentially tireless over long distances. Mongol horses could also scratch through snow and ice to reach the frozen grass beneath, a skill that made winter campaigning, almost universally avoided by medieval armies, not just possible but routine for the Mongols. What happened next shocked even their enemies. The Mongol system of psychological warfare was as sophisticated and as carefully planned as any military strategy in their arsenal, and it may have been even more effective than the arrows and the cavalry charges. Genghis Khan understood something that most conquerors either never learned or learned too late: that the most powerful weapon in war is not the one that kills soldiers, but the one that kills the will to resist. The Mongols were masters of what we would today call information warfare. Before they arrived at a city, they would send envoys with a simple, clear message: surrender completely, and your people will be spared and absorbed into the empire. Resist, and every living soul inside your walls will be destroyed. And they followed through on both promises with absolute, unwavering consistency. Cities that surrendered found themselves integrated peacefully and often prosperously into the Mongol system. Cities that resisted were obliterated so completely that sometimes the only evidence of their existence left was the rubble beneath the grass. The destruction of Zhongdu, the capital of the Jin dynasty in northern China, stands as one of the most chilling examples of Mongol psychological warfare combined with military power. After a prolonged siege and the city's eventual fall in 1215, the destruction was so complete that travelers passing through the region months later reported that the bones of the dead had formed mountains, that the soil was still soaked with fat from the burned bodies, and that the smell of death hung over the ruins for miles in every direction. Genghis Khan was not present for the final sack. He had already moved on to other campaigns. But the message that Zhongdu sent to every city and kingdom within 1,000 miles of the event was perfectly clear: resistance meant annihilation. Not defeat, not occupation, annihilation. This was not random cruelty. It was calculated, deliberate, and astonishingly effective. City after city, kingdom after kingdom chose to open their gates rather than face what had happened to Zhongdu. The psychological weight of that single event saved the Mongols the cost of dozens of future sieges. The Mongol art of the feigned retreat was arguably the most brilliant tactical maneuver in the history of pre-modern warfare. On the surface, it appeared simple, perhaps dangerously simple. A portion of the Mongol force would advance, make contact with the enemy, engage briefly, and then turn and flee in apparent panic and disorder. And the enemy, seeing the feared Mongol warriors apparently breaking and running, would inevitably do the natural thing. They would chase. This was the trap. The fleeing Mongol riders were not retreating, they were leading. They were drawing the enemy force out of its defensive formation, stretching its lines, breaking up its cohesion, pulling it across ground that had been scouted and prepared toward positions where the bulk of the Mongol army waited in concealment. Sometimes the feigned retreat lasted for hours and covered miles. Enemy commanders who understood what was happening still found themselves almost powerless to stop their own soldiers from giving chase, because the temptation of pursuing a breaking enemy is one of the deepest instincts in military psychology. When the trap finally closed, the result was almost always catastrophic for the pursuers. But this is where things take an unexpected turn. The Mongols did not simply rely on cavalry and archery. By the time of the Great Western Campaigns, Genghis Khan's army had developed a siege capability that matched and in some respects exceeded the best military engineering in the world. This transformation happened because of one of Genghis Khan's most underappreciated qualities, his willingness, eagerness, even, to adopt and absorb the technologies and expertise of conquered peoples. Chinese engineers who had survived the conquest of northern China were integrated directly into the Mongol army and tasked with building and operating the sophisticated siege machinery that had once defended Chinese cities against the Mongols themselves. Persian engineers added their own expertise. Engineers from Central Asian cities contributed knowledge of mobile siege towers and counterweight trebuchets. The result was a Mongol siege corps that could bring down walls, undermine foundations, divert rivers, fill moats, and overwhelm fortifications that had been specifically designed to resist the kind of direct assault that nomadic cavalry forces typically mounted. The trebuchet, the great counterweight siege engine of the Middle Ages, became one of the Mongols' most decisive siege weapons, and they used it with a creativity and ferocity that astonished defenders who thought they understood the weapon. Standard military use of the trebuchet involved hurling heavy stone balls at enemy walls to breach them. The Mongols used it for all of this and more. They launched pots of burning naphtha over walls to start fires inside the city. They launched diseased corpses, sometimes the bodies of plague victims, over the walls of besieged cities, in what historians now recognize as one of the earliest recorded uses of biological warfare. During the siege of Kaffa, a Genoese trading port on the Black Sea, in 1346, a Mongol army catapulted plague-infected corpses into the city, triggering an outbreak that some historians believe the fleeing survivors carried back to Europe, contributing to the spread of the Black Death. Whether or not this single event caused the Great Plague is debated, but the tactic itself, weaponizing disease, demonstrates a level of strategic imagination that was centuries ahead of its time. The YAM system, the Mongol Postal and Communication Network, was one of the great engineering achievements of the medieval world, and yet it receives almost none of the attention that it deserves in popular historical accounts. Established by Genghis Khan and massively expanded by his successors, particularly Ogedei Khan, the YAM was a network of relay stations placed at regular intervals, roughly every 25 to 40 kilometers, across the entire length and breadth of the Mongol Empire. At each station, fresh horses were kept in constant readiness, along with food, shelter, and attendance. An official rider carrying a peza, a tablet of authority that identified him as a Mongol imperial messenger, could travel at full speed from station to station, switching horses at each relay point and barely pausing, for hundreds or thousands of miles. The system could move information across the empire at speeds that stunned outside observers. Marco Polo, who traveled through the Mongol Empire in the late 13th century, described the YAM in detail and was clearly astonished by its efficiency. At its height, the network spanned thousands of miles and included tens of thousands of horses and hundreds of relay stations. The discipline of the Mongol army was legendary, and it was enforced with a severity that would seem shocking even by the harsh standards of medieval warfare. Genghis Khan's law code, the Yasa, established a framework of military conduct that was remarkably sophisticated for its time and absolutely non-negotiable in its application. Cowardice in battle was punishable by death, not just for the individual soldier, but sometimes for the entire unit of 10 that he belonged to. This collective punishment system, called decimation in some forms, ensured that soldiers policed each other's courage, because a single coward could get 9 other men executed alongside him. Abandoning a comrade in battle, looting before the battle was officially over, withholding plunder from the central distribution, failing to report found property to the leadership, all of these offenses carried severe consequences. But the discipline cut both ways. Soldiers who performed exceptionally were rewarded generously, promoted regardless of their tribal background, and given access to an enormous share of the plunder that the empire generated. The Mongol warrior's relationship with death was unlike that of any other fighting force of the era, and understanding it requires understanding the spiritual world that Mongols inhabited. The dominant religious tradition among the Mongols at the time of the Great Conquests was Tengrism, a shamanistic belief system centered on the sky god Tengri and a deeply animistic relationship with the natural world. Mongol warriors believed that a warrior who died in battle went directly to an honored place in the afterlife, attended by his horses and his weapons, continuing in the service of the eternal sky. But they also carried a superstition about blood that profoundly shaped the way they killed. Spilling the blood of a great man or king was considered ritually polluting and spiritually dangerous. It was believed to release the victim's power in a way that could harm the killer. This is why Mongol warriors developed the practice of executing noble prisoners and defeated kings without shedding their blood, wrapping them in felt and trampling them with horses, or strangling them, or suffocating them beneath heavy objects. Gruesome, yes, but deeply rooted in a coherent spiritual logic. The scale of the Mongol conquests in purely geographic terms is almost impossible to process without visual aid. At its greatest extent, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Korean peninsula in the east to the borders of Poland and Hungary in the west, from the frozen tundra of Siberia in the north to the jungles of Southeast Asia in the south. No empire in human history, before or since, has controlled a larger contiguous landmass. The Roman Empire at its height, the British Empire at its most expansive, the empires of Alexander the Great, all of them were smaller. The Mongol Empire at its peak covered roughly 24 million square kilometers, an area so vast that if you were to drive across it in a modern car at highway speeds, stopping only for fuel, it would take you weeks. The empire contained roughly a quarter of the entire world's population at the time of its greatest extent and generated a flow of trade and cultural exchange along the Silk Road that fundamentally shaped the development of Eurasia for centuries to come. What is almost never discussed in popular accounts of the Mongols is the extraordinary degree of religious tolerance that Genghis Khan built into the foundations of his empire. This was not soft-hearted idealism, it was hard-nosed pragmatism of the highest order. Genghis Khan himself appears to have been genuinely curious about religion and spirituality, holding debates between Buddhist monks, Muslim imams, Christian priests, and Taoist scholars at his court. But his policy of religious tolerance was also a practical recognition that forcing religious conformity on conquered peoples was an expensive and ultimately self-defeating exercise that generated endless rebellion. By allowing conquered peoples to maintain their faiths, their temples, and their religious leaders, and by actively exempting clergy of all religions from taxation, Genghis Khan bought the compliance of religious institutions across the empire and deprived potential rebels of one of the most powerful motivators for resistance. The result was an empire in which Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Taoists, Nestorians, and shamanists all coexisted, often uneasily, under Mongol rule, an experiment in pluralism that was in many ways more sophisticated than anything occurring in Europe at the same time. The Mongol warriors' physical conditioning was extraordinary even by the brutal standards of the medieval world. Life on the steppe was itself a form of constant physical training. Herding animals required endurance and riding skill. Hunting required stealth, patience, and explosive athleticism. Surviving the Mongolian winter required a core physical toughness that men who had grown up in warmer, more settled environments simply did not possess. But beyond the baseline conditioning that steppe life provided, Mongol warriors engaged in specific martial training that was organized, systematic, and deeply serious. Wrestling, known as Mongolian bok, was considered one of the three great Mongol sports, alongside horsemanship and archery. Warriors trained in wrestling not for sport alone but because the physical skills it developed, strength, balance, the ability to control an opponent's body, the ability to fall without injury, were directly applicable to dismounted combat. Mongol wrestlers competed in regional and national tournaments that were taken extremely seriously and that served to identify the most physically gifted warriors for special roles and recognition. The Great Hunt, the Nurj, was one of the Mongol military's most brilliantly conceived training exercises, and it simultaneously served as the army's primary mechanism for developing coordinated large-unit tactics. A Nurj was a communal hunt conducted on a massive scale, sometimes involving tens of thousands of warriors, that could last for weeks or even months. The warriors would form a vast encircling line across hundreds of square miles of steppe, then gradually close in from all directions, driving all the game inside the circle: rabbits, wolves, foxes, deer, wild boar, lions, everything, toward the center. The circle contracted slowly and systematically, with absolute discipline required at every point to prevent animals from breaking through the human wall. At the end of the hunt, when the animals were concentrated in the center and the circle had closed, Genghis Khan himself would be the first to enter and begin killing, followed by his senior generals, then his soldiers, in strict order of seniority. The tactical lessons this exercise taught: maintaining formation discipline over vast distances, coordinating the movements of thousands of dispersed units, preventing an encircled force from breaking out, were precisely the lessons needed for the great encirclement maneuvers that the Mongol army used to such devastating effect in battle. Genghis Khan's intelligence network was, by the standards of the 13th century, essentially unprecedented. Before any major campaign, he dispatched scouts and spies, sometimes disguised as merchants, deep into the territory he intended to conquer. These agents gathered information on roads, river crossings, mountain passes, the location of food and water sources, the strength and disposition of enemy forces, the political relationships and tensions within enemy kingdoms, and the personalities and vulnerabilities of enemy commanders. This intelligence was systematically compiled and used to plan campaigns in extraordinary detail before the first arrow was ever fired. Genghis Khan knew, often with remarkable precision, what he was riding toward. His enemies, by contrast, typically had very little reliable information about the Mongols until the Mongols were already on their doorstep. This asymmetry of intelligence was one of the most decisive advantages the Mongol army possessed, and it explains why so many of their campaigns appeared, from the outside, to be conducted with an almost supernatural ability to exploit enemy weaknesses at exactly the right moment. The Mongol warrior carried a remarkably diverse toolkit into battle. In addition to the composite bow and its quivers, most warriors carried a curved saber for close-quarters fighting, a lance for the initial shock of cavalry charge, and a lasso, the urga, which could be used to unhorse enemy riders, drag men from fortifications, or capture prisoners alive when the mission required it. Many warriors also carried a short, curved dagger for use in the chaos of close combat when there was no room to swing a sword. Heavy cavalry warriors, a minority of the force, wore lamellar armor constructed from small plates of leather, bone, or metal laced together with leather cords, and carried a shield. But the majority of Mongol warriors traveled as light cavalry, wearing only a leather jerkin and a metal or leather helmet, relying on speed and maneuverability rather than armor for their protection. This difference in equipment reflected a philosophical approach to warfare that prioritized mobility above all else. Armor protects, but it also slows, and in Mongol doctrine, the ability to move faster than the enemy was worth more than the ability to absorb more punishment. Genghis Khan's approach to the battlefield was shaped by a concept that military historians today call combined arms, the coordinated use of different types of forces to create synergies that none of them could achieve individually. The light cavalry archers would advance and shower the enemy with arrows, disrupting their formation, picking off leaders, and forcing the enemy to spread out or close ranks, either option making them more vulnerable. When the enemy advanced to drive off the archers would fall back, drawing the enemy into prepared kill zones where heavy cavalry waited to strike into their exposed flanks. When the enemy retreated into defensive formation, engineers would advance to begin siege operations. When the enemy tried to concentrate against a threat, Mongol units on the flanks would swing wide, threatening encirclement and forcing a dispersal that left no part of the enemy formation strong enough to resist an attack. Every action the enemy took created an opportunity. The Mongol army was designed, from the ground up, to make every choice the enemy made a bad one. The concept of meritocracy ran deep in Genghis Khan's military system, and it represented one of the most radical departures from the social norms of the era. In the tribal world of the Mongolian steppe, leadership was traditionally determined by birth. The son of a chief became a chief, regardless of talent. Genghis Khan abolished this system within his army with remarkable decisiveness. Promotion in the Mongol military was based on demonstrated ability, loyalty, and results, not ancestry. Some of Genghis Khan's most trusted and senior generals came from conquered tribes, from rival clans, even from peoples that had been bitter enemies of the Mongols before the Great Unification. Jebe, one of the greatest Mongol generals, first came to Genghis Khan's attention because he shot Genghis Khan's horse out from under him in battle, and then, when captured, admitted it openly and without apology. Genghis Khan, rather than executing him, promoted him for his honesty and his skill. Gebe went on to lead one of the most extraordinary cavalry campaigns in history, riding completely around the Caspian Sea in a reconnaissance of potential Western conquest routes. The speed of the Mongol conquests was not just a matter of military effectiveness, it was also a product of the extraordinary adaptability of Mongol forces to different climates, terrains, and tactical environments. Other great conquerors of history tended to operate most effectively in specific types of terrain and struggled severely when they moved outside their geographic comfort zone. Alexander the Great's Macedonian phalanx was devastating on open ground but clumsy in mountains and forests. The Roman legions were magnificent on flat terrain with room to maneuver but vulnerable in the confined valleys and thick forests of northern Europe. The Mongols, by contrast, proved capable of fighting effectively in deserts, steppes, mountains, jungles, river valleys, frozen plains, and even at sea. Their willingness to adopt the weapons, tactics, and expertise of conquered peoples allowed them to transform their army continuously, incorporating new capabilities without losing the core flexibility and speed that made them so dangerous. There is something almost hypnotic about the way Mongol armies communicated during battle, a system of signals so precise and so reliable that it could coordinate the movements of forces spread across a front many miles wide with a speed and accuracy that no other medieval army could match. The primary communication tools were visual, large black and white flags called tug, which relayed coded messages from unit to unit across the battlefield. The exact meanings of different flag positions and sequences were standardized throughout the army and drilled into every officer until they became reflex. In conditions of poor visibility, dust storms, smoke, night operations, drums and horns took over, each pattern of beats or calls corresponding to a specific command. These were not improvised signals. They were a formal military language that had been developed over decades of practice and refined through experience. The result was a battlefield command and control system that allowed Mongol commanders to react to changing conditions with a speed and precision that gave them a decisive decision-making advantage over virtually every enemy they faced. The campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, launched in 1219, remains one of the most audacious and precisely planned military operations in the history of the ancient or medieval world. The Khwarezmian Empire at the time was one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world, stretching across modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, with a population many times larger than the Mongols' own and an army of comparable size. The campaign began, as many Mongol campaigns did, with a diplomatic incident. The Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, executed a Mongol trade delegation of roughly 500 merchants on suspicion of espionage, and then killed the Mongol ambassadors sent to demand an explanation. This was one of the most catastrophically miscalculated decisions in the history of diplomacy. Genghis Khan's response was to mobilize the largest force he had ever assembled, somewhere between 100 and 200,000 warriors, and personally lead it on a campaign of annihilation that within 2 years had effectively destroyed one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world. What followed the opening of the Khwarezmian campaign demonstrated a tactical innovation that continued to astonish military historians to this day. Rather than advancing on the Khwarezmian Empire along a single predictable axis, Genghis Khan divided his army into multiple independent columns that advanced simultaneously along different routes, some separated by hundreds of miles of desert and mountain. This approach prevented the Khwarezmian forces from concentrating against any single Mongol force, forced them to disperse their own army in an attempt to defend everywhere at once, and created strategic confusion that paralyzed the Khwarezmian command structure. Samarkand, one of the jewels of the Islamic world, fell to Mongol forces approaching from an unexpected direction because its garrison had been led to believe the main Mongol attack was coming from a completely different compass point. The city's defenders found themselves outmaneuvered not by superior numbers or better weapons, but by superior strategic thinking applied at the level of an entire campaign rather than a single battle. Genghis Khan's relationship with his four principal sons, Joki, Chagatai, Ogedai, and Talyui, was one of the great political dramas of the early Mongol Empire and had enormous consequences for the military campaigns that followed his death. The question of succession was complicated from the beginning by persistent rumors that Jochi, the eldest, was not Genghis Khan's biological son, that his mother, Borte, had been pregnant with Jochi when she was rescued from captivity, raising uncomfortable questions about paternity that Genghis Khan himself publicly refused to engage with but that clearly created tension. The four sons had dramatically different personalities. Jochi was reportedly brave and generous but also capable of insubordination. Chagatai was a strict enforcer of Mongol law but inflexible and sometimes cruel. Ogdi was a gifted political administrator and a capable military commander. And Talyui was the most militarily talented of the four but also the one Genghis Khan eventually passed over for the supreme leadership. These dynamics shaped the post-Genghis Mongol Empire in ways both subtle and dramatic. The system of plunder distribution within the Mongol army was one of the most carefully regulated aspects of the entire military organization, and it played a crucial role in maintaining the loyalty and enthusiasm of the warriors who served in it. When a city was taken or a campaign concluded, the accumulated wealth, gold, silver, livestock, food, silk, skilled artisans, horses, was not simply distributed randomly or taken by whoever grabbed it first. A formal accounting was conducted, and the plunder was divided according to a strict hierarchical formula. Genghis Khan and the royal family received a fixed share. Senior generals received their portion. Individual warriors received shares scaled to their rank and to their specific contributions to the campaign. Widows and orphans of fallen warriors received shares equal to those of living soldiers, ensuring that families were not left destitute when a warrior died in service. This system of regulated, equitable distribution was extraordinarily effective at sustaining the motivation of the army across decades of continuous campaigning and created a powerful financial incentive for expansion that reinforced the military and political drivers of conquest. The Mongol treatment of artisans, scholars, and skilled craftspeople in conquered territories stands in stark and often overlooked contrast to their treatment of soldiers who resisted. While warriors who fought back were killed and civilian populations of resistant cities were sometimes massacred or enslaved, artisans, weavers, metalworkers, jewelers, engineers, architects, physicians, scribes, were systematically identified, carefully preserved, and transported to the Mongol heartland or to other parts of the empire where their skills were needed. This was not merely pragmatic looting of human capital, though it was certainly that. It reflected a deep understanding that the skills of these craftspeople were among the most valuable resources a conquered territory possessed. The result of this policy was a massive transfer of technical knowledge and artistic tradition from every corner of the known world into the Mongol Empire, creating a cultural and technological efflorescence at the Mongol courts that outsiders who expected to find barbarism were consistently astonished to encounter. The Mongol warrior's relationship with his horse extended far beyond the practical. Horses were central to Mongol spiritual life, to Mongol ceremony, and to the Mongol conception of status and identity. A warrior's horses were buried with him when he died, in the belief that he would need them in the afterlife. The finest horses were consecrated to Tingri and marked with special symbols that indicated their sacred status and removed them from ordinary use. Horse racing was one of the three manly sports of the Mongol tradition, and races covering extraordinary distances, sometimes up to 30 kilometers, were held at major festivals as tests of both horse quality and rider skill. The Mongolian festival of Naadam, which still exists today in modern Mongolia, preserves these three sports, wrestling, archery, and horse racing, in a form that connects the modern nation directly to the warriors of Genghis Khan's era. When a Mongol warrior lost his horse in battle, he felt not just a tactical disadvantage but a personal catastrophe, as if a part of himself had been stripped away. This is not hyperbole. It reflects the genuine depth of the bond between Mongol warrior and Mongol horse. The Mongol Empire's attitude toward trade and merchants was dramatically different from the attitude of most contemporary states, and this difference had enormous military as well as economic consequences. Most medieval states taxed trade heavily, restricted the movement of foreign merchants, and treated commercial travelers with suspicion. The Mongols, under Genghis Khan and his successors, did the opposite. Merchants traveling along the Silk Road under Mongol protection were given the Pesa, the tablet of authority that guaranteed their safety throughout the empire. Taxes on trade were relatively low and consistently applied. Infrastructure, roads, bridges, relay stations, was maintained. The result was an explosion of long-distance trade across Eurasia that made the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, one of the great commercial eras in human history. And the military benefit was clear. A prosperous merchant network provided intelligence about the territories beyond the empire's borders, kept the empire's own economy healthy enough to fund further campaigns, and gave the Mongol leadership a sophisticated picture of the wider world that pure military intelligence could not provide. The Mongol siege of Xiangyang, which lasted from 1267 to 1273, 6 years, stands as one of the most remarkable military operations in the history of Chinese warfare and represents the absolute pinnacle of the Mongol military's capacity for sustained, patient, strategic effort. Xiangyang was a twin-city fortress on the Han River in central China, and it controlled the approach route to the heartland of the Song dynasty in southern China. The Mongol commander Kublai Khan understood that taking Xiangyang was the key to the conquest of southern China, but the city's defenses and its ability to receive supplies by river made a conventional assault either impossible or prohibitively costly. Rather than assault the walls, the Mongols settled in for a siege, constructing their own fortifications to cut off the city by land, deploying a naval fleet to block the river approaches, and systematically waiting while the city's garrison and population slowly consumed their reserves. When the defenses finally fell, it was partly because of the arrival of massive counterweight trebuchets, the mangonel, brought from Persia specifically for this siege, capable of hurling stones with a force and accuracy that the city's walls, designed to resist the weapons of the era, could not withstand. The Battle of Mohi, fought in April 1241 in the Kingdom of Hungary, was one of the most catastrophic military defeats ever suffered by a European army, and it demonstrated with brutal clarity the gap that existed between Mongol military capability and the best that medieval Europe could offer. The Hungarian army under King Bela IV, numbering somewhere between 60 and 100,000 men, was numerically comparable to the invading Mongol force and was not without military experience. But it was organized along traditional European lines, heavily armored cavalry relying on the shock of direct charge, infantry that was slow and tactically inflexible, a command structure that valued individual heroism over coordinated strategy. The Mongols under Batu Khan and the brilliant General Subutai met the Hungarian force at the Sejo River and proceeded to destroy it with a precision that seemed almost contemptuous. A frontal attack pinned the Hungarian center while Mongol forces crossed the river on a separate bridge, flanked the Hungarian position, and closed a trap that the Hungarians, by the time they understood what was happening, had no means of escaping. The result was a slaughter that left tens of thousands dead in the field. What happened next, after Mohi, is one of the great unanswered questions of medieval history. The Mongol army that had just destroyed the Hungarian force was positioned for a drive into Western Europe, into Germany, into France, toward the Atlantic coast. Nothing stood between them and Paris. The armies of the Holy Roman Empire, of France, of England, none of them had demonstrated any capacity to resist what the Mongols had just done to Hungary. And yet, in the spring of 1242, the Mongol forces suddenly turned around and rode east, never to return to Europe in force. The death of Ogidi Khan in December 1241 has traditionally been given as the reason. Batu and Subutai had to return east for the Kurultai, the great assembly that would choose a new great Khan. But military historians point out that the campaign may also have been running into practical supply problems. The European terrain, with its forests and mountains, was poorly suited to Mongol cavalry operations, and the agricultural heartland of Hungary, which had been devastated by the campaign itself, could not support the horses and men of a continued westward drive. Whatever the reason, Europe survived the Mongol storm by the narrowest of margins. The organization of the Mongol army extended beyond the battlefield into what we would today call logistical management, and the sophistication of this management was one of the least glamorous but most decisive factors in Mongol military success. Supply chains for medieval armies were notoriously difficult to maintain over long distances, and the failure of supply was responsible for the defeat of more great campaigns than any military force in history. The Mongol army minimized this problem through a combination of approaches. The self-sufficiency of each warrior, his ability to live off his horses and whatever the land provided, reduced the quantity of supplies that needed to be transported from a fixed base. The rolling herd of additional horses, sheep, and cattle that accompanied every major Mongol force provided a mobile food source that consumed no transport capacity and renewed itself through grazing. Captured supplies were systematically organized and distributed rather than randomly looted. And the yam relay system ensured that critical communications and small quantities of essential materials could move across the empire with enough speed to allow the leadership to respond to supply problems before they became crises. The role of women in the Mongol military world was far more significant than most popular accounts suggest, and understanding it requires setting aside the assumptions that medieval European society might lead us to project onto a completely different cultural context. Mongol women did not typically ride into battle alongside men, though there are recorded instances of women who did, and Mongol tradition includes a concept of female warriors called Khatan that appears in both history and legend. But Mongol women were responsible for the management of the great mobile camps, the Ordo, that served as the logistical base and command center of every major campaign. They managed the herds, the supplies, the tents, the household goods, and often the political and diplomatic affairs of the camp in the absence of the men. Senior wives of great khans exercised considerable political power and could serve as regents, actual rulers of parts of the empire, during the intervals between the death of one ruler and the confirmation of his successor. Torajin Khatun, wife of Ogedai Khan, served as regent of the entire Mongol Empire for 5 years following her husband's death and made major political decisions that shaped the course of the empire's history. The Mongol warrior's emotional and psychological life has been largely obscured by the historical record, which tends to focus on battles, conquests, and political events, but glimpses of it appear in sources like The Secret History of the Mongols, one of the most extraordinary documents to survive from the medieval world. Written in the Mongol language sometime in the mid-13th century, possibly shortly after Genghis Khan's death, The Secret History reads at times like an epic poem, at times like a royal chronicle, and at times like something disturbingly personal, a record of the emotional landscape of the Mongol world that historians do not usually have access to in this period. It describes Genghis Khan weeping at the death of his companion Borchu. It records his fury and grief when his mother was abducted by enemies. It shows him wrestling with questions of loyalty, betrayal, and justice in ways that are recognizably human in their complexity. The warriors of his army were not simply killing machines, they were people embedded in a rich web of personal loyalty, tribal identity, family obligation, and individual ambition. The Mongol legal system, the Yasa, represented one of Genghis Khan's most innovative and consequential creations, and its influence on the military was inseparable from its influence on Mongol society as a whole. The Yasa was not written down during Genghis Khan's lifetime, or at least no written copy has survived. Scholars reconstruct its contents from references in other sources. But its provisions, as best as they can be determined, were remarkable for the 13th century. Equality before the law regardless of social status, strict prohibition on the enslavement of Mongols by other Mongols, religious freedom and the tax exemption of clergy, standardized rules for trade and property, severe penalties for theft, adultery, and certain forms of deception. Within the military, the Yasa established the codes of conduct, the rules of plunder distribution, the penalties for cowardice and insubordination, and the rights of warriors and their families that made the army function as a cohesive unit rather than a mob of individually motivated fighters. The genius of the Yasa was that it was law everyone lived under, including the Khan himself, at least in principle. Subutai the Valiant, Subutai Badr, was arguably the greatest purely military commander in the history of the Mongol Empire and one of the greatest in all of human history, and yet he remains almost completely unknown to the general public outside of specialist circles. Born into a clan of blacksmiths, he rose through the Mongol military entirely on the basis of talent and was commanding independent forces by the time he was in his 20s. Over the course of his career, he fought in more than 65 major engagements, invaded 32 nations, and never lost a campaign. He commanded the reconnaissance expedition that rode around the Caspian Sea and defeated armies in Russia, Georgia, and the Caucasus. He planned and directed the invasion of Eastern Europe in 1241 with a strategic sophistication that military historians in the 20th century, modeling his campaigns with modern operations research methods, have described as essentially flawless. He was the architect of Mohi. He conquered territories in Russia and Eastern Europe while coordinating multiple army groups operating on fronts separated by hundreds of miles. He died peacefully in 1248 at roughly 70 years of age, one of the very few great Mongol commanders to die in bed. The psychological impact of the Mongol invasion on the Islamic world in the 13th century was, in the words of the great medieval Arab historian Ibn al-Athir, something for which no previous catastrophe in human history had provided adequate preparation. Ibn al-Athir, writing in the 1220s, described seeing a single Mongol horseman ride into a village of 100 people and begin executing them one by one, while the villagers stood and watched, paralyzed by a terror so complete that no one even attempted to run. He found this almost impossible to explain. These were not cowardly people. These were people who had been stripped of all psychological framework for resistance by the sheer scale of what had fallen on them. The speed of the Mongol advance, the comprehensiveness of the destruction of cities that had resisted, the apparent impossibility of resistance, and the total absence of any authority capable of offering protection had combined to create a paralysis of will that the Mongols understood perfectly and exploited with ruthless efficiency. The fear itself was a weapon, perhaps the most powerful weapon in the Mongol arsenal. Genghis Khan's death in 1227 remains one of the great mysteries of medieval history, and the deliberate concealment of the circumstances of his passing by the Mongols themselves has ensured that it will likely never be fully resolved. The official explanation, that he died of injuries sustained when he fell from his horse during a hunting expedition, has been questioned by historians for centuries. Other theories include that he was killed by a Tangut arrow during the final campaign against the Western Xia kingdom, that he was poisoned, that he died of an infection, that he was killed by a captured Tangut queen who hid a weapon and attacked him during the night. The Chinese chronicler from the Song dynasty suggested a still more dramatic end. Genghis Khan himself ordered that the circumstances of his death be concealed and that his funeral cortege be conducted in absolute secrecy. The men who accompanied his body to its burial place, believed to be somewhere in the Khentai Mountains of Mongolia, allegedly killed anyone they encountered on the route to preserve the secret of the location. Then they too were killed. The horses that attended the funeral were run back and forth over the grave until the ground was indistinguishable from the surrounding steppe. To this day, despite decades of search by historians and archaeologists using satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar, the tomb of Genghis Khan has never been found. The campaign against the Jin dynasty in northern China, which began in 1211 and continued for more than 20 years, demonstrated the Mongol military's capacity to sustain a major campaign over an extended period and against a sophisticated, well-armed opponent. The Jin dynasty was one of the most powerful states in East Asia, with an army of perhaps 1 million men, many times larger than the entire Mongol force. It possessed the most advanced military technology in the world, including gunpowder weapons, firebombs, early firearms, and explosive projectiles that were unlike anything the Mongols had encountered before. And yet the Mongols prevailed. They did so through a combination of strategic patience, tactical adaptation, and the systematic erosion of the Jin dynasty's ability to field and sustain its armies, cutting supply lines, winning over local populations, recruiting defectors, and applying relentless pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously until the Jin's vast numerical advantage was reduced to irrelevance by an inability to concentrate force effectively. The campaign was a masterclass in what modern strategists call attrition warfare at the operational level. But this is where things take an unexpected turn. The Mongol Empire, despite being built on an extraordinarily sophisticated military machine, carried within it the seeds of its own eventual dissolution, and those seeds were planted, paradoxically, by the very success of the conquests. The Mongol warriors who conquered the great sedentary civilizations of China, Persia, and Central Asia found themselves ruling urban, agricultural, and commercial societies for which nothing in their steppe background had prepared them. Each of the successor states, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, gradually adapted to the cultures of the peoples it ruled. Mongol rulers in China became Chinese-style emperors. Mongols in Persia converted to Islam. Mongols in Russia became entangled in the political structures of the Rus principalities. Over the course of the 14th century, these successor states increasingly defined themselves against each other rather than as components of a unified empire, and the military power that had been the foundation of Mongol dominance fragmented along with the political unity. The arrowhead used by Mongol warriors was not a single standardized design but a precisely differentiated family of projectile types, each optimized for a specific tactical purpose, reflecting a level of sophisticated military engineering that the warriors themselves understood as intimately as a carpenter understands his chisels. Broadhead arrows with wide, flat cutting surfaces were used against unarmored or lightly armored targets, infantry, horses, exposed cavalry, where maximum tissue damage was the goal. Armor-piercing arrows with hardened, narrow points, sometimes called bodkin points, were used against armored opponents, where penetrating the protection was more important than creating a large wound. Fire arrows tipped with materials that could carry flaming compounds were used for incendiary attacks on buildings, camps, and siege equipment. Signal arrows with perforated heads that whistled in flight were used for battlefield communication and to coordinate attacks across distances where visual signals might be missed. Blunt-tipped arrows were used in training and sometimes in hunting when a whole skin was wanted. This differentiation was not accidental. It reflected decades of accumulated military experience and a systematic approach to solving tactical problems with engineered solutions. Genghis Khan's treatment of conquered cities was not uniform. It was a precisely calibrated system of reward and punishment designed to maximize both compliance and the long-term productivity of the empire. Cities that submitted before any military engagement were typically treated well, their leaders confirmed in their positions as Mongol vassals, their populations left largely intact, their institutions, markets, temples, administrative systems, preserved and sometimes strengthened. Cities that resisted briefly before capitulating might face looting and the execution of those who had led the resistance, but the general population would be spared. Cities that mounted determined and prolonged resistance before falling could expect total destruction, their walls razed, their leaders and much of their military-age male population killed, their artisans taken, and their remaining inhabitants enslaved or dispersed. And cities that surrendered and then rebelled, that broke their word to the Mongols, faced the most extreme consequences of all, because betrayal of an agreement was, in Genghis Khan's moral code, one of the worst possible offenses. Nishapur in modern Iran, which surrendered to the Mongols, then rose in revolt and killed a Mongol general, was subsequently annihilated so completely that ancient texts record even the cats and dogs being killed. The Battle of the Khalkha River, fought in 1223 in what is now southern Ukraine, introduced the Mongol army to the warriors of the Rus principalities for the first time, and the encounter ended exactly as virtually every first encounter between the Mongols and a new opponent did. A combined force of Kuman, Kipchak, nomads and Russian princes, numbering perhaps 80,000 warriors, met the Mongol reconnaissance force under Jebe and Subutai on the banks of the Khalkha River. The alliance was uneasy from the beginning. The Russian princes and the Kumans had different interests, different tactical doctrines, and different levels of understanding of the enemy they were facing. The Mongols used the feigned retreat to devastating effect, drawing the impulsive Kuman cavalry forward and then hitting them with the full weight of the Mongol heavy force when the Kumans had broken their formation. The Russian princes, watching from the rear, found themselves suddenly facing the full Mongol army without their allies and were routed in turn. Several captured Russian princes were laid beneath wooden boards on which the Mongol commanders sat and celebrated their victory, a death without bloodshed, in keeping with Mongol spiritual practice regarding the killing of rulers. The concept of total war, the mobilization of an entire society and economy for the purpose of military conquest, was something that the Mongol Empire understood and practiced long before it was theorized by modern military thinkers. Every aspect of Mongol society was organized, at least in part, around the requirements of military expansion. The great hunts trained warriors. The yam system maintained the military's communications. The artisans of conquered territories fed the military's technological development. The empire's trade networks funded the army. The collection of intelligence through merchants and diplomats supported strategic planning. Children were trained for military roles almost from birth. Even the religious and ceremonial life of the Mongols, the shamanic rituals performed before campaigns, the divination consulted before major decisions, the prayers and sacrifices offered to Tengri for victory, served to bind the community together around the project of conquest and to provide warriors with a psychological framework of divine mandate that reinforced their commitment and their courage. The Mongol invasion of Poland in 1241 was simultaneous with the invasion of Hungary, a strategic coordination of multiple army groups across an enormous front that has no parallel in medieval military history and very few parallels in any era before the 20th century. While Batu Khan and Subutai drove into Hungary from the east, another Mongol force under Kaidu and Baidar crossed into Poland from the north, defeating Polish and German forces at the Battle of Legnica, also called Liegnitz, on April 9, 1241, just 2 days before Mohi. The two battles were not accidents or coincidences, they were coordinated components of a single strategic plan designed to prevent German and Polish forces from reinforcing Hungary while the main Mongol effort destroyed the Hungarian army. The fact that these two major engagements, separated by hundreds of miles, were won within 48 hours of each other, and that neither enemy force had any idea the other engagement was happening, is a testament to the Mongol command structure's ability to execute complex, multi-column operations over enormous distances with a precision that rivals modern military coordination. The Mongol warrior's relationship with music and oral tradition was an essential part of his identity and his culture, and it helps explain the extraordinary coherence of Mongol military identity across vast distances and diverse tribal backgrounds. The great oral epic tradition of the Mongol people, of which the secret history is the most famous surviving example, served to transmit not just historical and legendary content but the values, the ideals, and the self-image of the warrior culture. Stories of great hunts, great battles, great acts of loyalty and treachery, great horses and great men, these were told and retold around fires across the steppe, creating a shared cultural narrative that gave warriors from different tribes a common identity and a common set of heroes to emulate. Music, including the long song tradition of Mongolian folk music, with its extraordinary vocal range and its evocation of the natural landscape of the steppe, performed a similar function. The morin kur, the horsehead fiddle, was the instrument most associated with warrior culture, and its sound was described by Mongol tradition as the voice of the horse itself, the animal that was the foundation of everything the warrior was. The fall of Baghdad in 1258, when a Mongol force under Hulagu Khan destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate and killed the last Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustasim, represents one of the most traumatic single events in the history of the Islamic world and one of the most consequential military actions of the entire Mongol era. Baghdad at the time was not just the capital of the Caliphate, it was the intellectual, cultural, and religious center of the Islamic world, home to the great library of the House of Wisdom, to scholars, physicians, mathematicians, poets, and philosophers whose work had been accumulating for centuries. The destruction of the city, the killing of the caliph, reportedly wrapped in a felt rug and trampled by horses, the bloodless death reserved for rulers, and the massacre of the population sent a shock through the Islamic world from which it took generations to recover. Ancient accounts, which may be somewhat exaggerated, describe the waters of the Tigris River running black with the ink of the destroyed books and red with the blood of the slain. Whatever the exact scale of the destruction, the symbolic impact was incalculable. The most important city of the Islamic world had been obliterated in a matter of days. What happened after Baghdad is a story that complicates any simple narrative of unstoppable Mongol conquest. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in the Jordan Valley, the first major defeat ever suffered by a Mongol army in the field, the Egyptian Mamluk forces under Baybars demonstrated that the Mongol military could be beaten. The Mamluks were themselves a warrior class of extraordinary capability, former Turkish slaves who had risen to military and eventually political dominance in Egypt, trained from childhood in horsemanship and archery in ways that bore some resemblance to Mongol military practice. Baybars used feigned retreats, flanking maneuvers, and superior local knowledge to draw the Mongol force, which was somewhat smaller than the usual Mongol strength, as much of the army had been recalled east by political crisis, into a trap in the narrow valley and destroyed. Ain Jalut is significant not just militarily but psychologically. It demonstrated that the Mongol army was not invincible, not divine, not a force of nature that human beings were helpless against. It was a powerful, well-organized, innovative military force that could be beaten by an opponent who was equally organized, equally innovative, and who used the terrain well. The Mongol Navy is one of the most fascinating and least known aspects of the empire's military history, not because it was particularly successful, it wasn't, but because of what it reveals about the limits of Mongol adaptability and the moments where the nomadic military tradition encountered environments it could not master. The two attempted invasions of Japan, in 1274 and 1281, represent the most dramatic examples. Kublai Khan, having established the Yuan dynasty in China, attempted to extend Mongol dominance to the Japanese islands by launching massive amphibious assault forces. The 1281 Armada reportedly numbered some 4,000 vessels and 140,000 men, making it one of the largest naval operations in history before the modern era. Both attempts failed, partly because of the fierce resistance of the Japanese samurai warriors who, like the Mamluks, had spent their lives preparing for exactly this kind of high-intensity combat, and partly because of typhoons that destroyed the Mongol fleets. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, divine winds, sent by the gods to protect Japan. The Mongol failure to conquer Japan remains the most significant military reversal in the history of the Yuan dynasty. The social structure of the Mongol army camp created a community that was simultaneously military and domestic, a moving city that carried within it everything necessary for the sustaining of a complex society. The Great Ordo, the mobile headquarters of a major Mongol force on campaign, included not just warriors but their families, their herds, their artisans, their shamans, their physicians, their scribes, and all the household goods necessary to maintain the social life of the community. The Ordo was organized with the same systematic precision as the military units themselves. Tents arranged in specific patterns, herds managed by assigned herdsmen, food preparation organized, medical care provided, religious ceremonies observed. This meant that the Mongol army was never truly separated from its social base in the way that conventional armies were. It carried its society with it, creating a self-sustaining mobile community that could operate indefinitely in the field without requiring connection to a fixed base. The military and the social were completely integrated, and this integration was one of the sources of the extraordinary resilience and endurance that characterized Mongol operations. Genghis Khan's mother, Holon, deserves recognition as one of the unsung architects of the Mongol Empire, a woman of extraordinary strength and wisdom whose influence on her son shaped the qualities that would make him one of the most consequential individuals in human history. When Temujin was 9 years old, his father Yasujii was poisoned by Tatar enemies on the steppe, and the clan that Yasujii had led simply abandoned the widow and her children on the grassland to die, taking their animals and their belongings. Holon refused to accept this death sentence. She fed her children by gathering wild plants, berries, and roots from the steppe, whatever she could find, sustaining them through conditions that would have killed most people. She maintained the family's dignity and coherence through years of desperate poverty and danger, instilling in her children a set of values: the supreme importance of loyalty, the treachery of abandonment, the necessity of strength, that are directly visible in the adult Genghis Khan's leadership philosophy. Temujin's earliest experiences of betrayal, survival, and the absolute importance of personal loyalty were all shaped by these years under his mother's fierce and loving care. The Mongol military's approach to the siege of fortified cities evolved dramatically over the course of the empire's history, beginning with a profound weakness and ending with one of the most sophisticated siege capabilities in the medieval world. In the early campaigns, before the incorporation of Chinese and Central Asian engineers, the Mongol army had essentially no effective siege capability at all. Their strength was speed and archery on open ground, and walls were an almost insuperable obstacle. Genghis Khan's response to this limitation was characteristically pragmatic. He avoided assaulting strongly fortified positions directly, preferred to draw defenders out with feigned retreats and threats to their supply lines, and when cities had to be taken, relied on blockade, stratagem, and the terrifying power of his reputation to induce surrender before the question of wall assault arose. Over time, as the empire grew and incorporated conquered engineering expertise, this limitation was progressively eliminated. By the time of Kublai Khan's campaigns in southern China in the 1270s, the Mongol siege corps could deploy counterweight trebuchets capable of hurling 300-pound stones with devastating accuracy, weapons that could reduce any fortification of the era to rubble given enough time. What happened after Baghdad is a story that complicates any simple narrative of unstoppable Mongol conquest. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in the Jordan Valley, the first major defeat ever suffered by a Mongol army in the field, the Egyptian Mamluk forces under Baybars demonstrated that the Mongol military could be beaten. The Mamluks were themselves a warrior class of extraordinary capability, former Turkish slaves who had risen to military and eventually political dominance in Egypt, trained from childhood in horsemanship and archery in ways that bore some resemblance to Mongol military practice. Baybars used feigned retreats, flanking maneuvers, and superior local knowledge to draw the Mongol force, which was somewhat smaller than the usual Mongol strength, as much of the army had been recalled east by political crisis, into a trap in the narrow valley and destroyed. Ain Jalut is significant not just militarily but psychologically. It demonstrated that the Mongol army was not invincible, not divine, not a force of nature that human beings were helpless against. It was a powerful, well-organized, innovative military force that could be beaten by an opponent who was equally organized, equally innovative, and who used the terrain well. The Mongol Navy is one of the most fascinating and least known aspects of the empire's military history, not because it was particularly successful, it wasn't, but because of what it reveals about the limits of Mongol adaptability and the moments where the nomadic military tradition encountered environments it could not master. The two attempted invasions of Japan, in 1274 and 1281, represent the most dramatic examples. Kublai Khan, having established the Yuan dynasty in China, attempted to extend Mongol dominance to the Japanese islands by launching massive amphibious assault forces. The 1281 Armada reportedly numbered some 4,000 vessels and 140,000 men, making it one of the largest naval operations in history before the modern era. Both attempts failed, partly because of the fierce resistance of the Japanese samurai warriors who, like the Mamluks, had spent their lives preparing for exactly this kind of high-intensity combat, and partly because of typhoons that destroyed the Mongol fleets. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, divine winds, sent by the gods to protect Japan. The Mongol failure to conquer Japan remains the most significant military reversal in the history of the Yuan dynasty. The social structure of the Mongol army camp created a community that was simultaneously military and domestic, a moving city that carried within it everything necessary for the sustaining of a complex society. The Great Ordo, the mobile headquarters of a major Mongol force on campaign, included not just warriors but their families, their herds, their artisans, their shamans, their physicians, their scribes, and all the household goods necessary to maintain the social life of the community. The Ordo was organized with the same systematic precision as the military units themselves. Tents arranged in specific patterns, herds managed by assigned herdsmen, food preparation organized, medical care provided, religious ceremonies observed. This meant that the Mongol army was never truly separated from its social base in the way that conventional armies were. It carried its society with it, creating a self-sustaining mobile community that could operate indefinitely in the field without requiring connection to a fixed base. The military and the social were completely integrated, and this integration was one of the sources of the extraordinary resilience and endurance that characterized Mongol operations. Genghis Khan's mother, Holon, deserves recognition as one of the unsung architects of the Mongol Empire, a woman of extraordinary strength and wisdom whose influence on her son shaped the qualities that would make him one of the most consequential individuals in human history. When Temujin was 9 years old, his father Yasujii was poisoned by Tatar enemies on the steppe, and the clan that Yasujii had led simply abandoned the widow and her children on the grassland to die, taking their animals and their belongings. Holan refused to accept this death sentence. She fed her children by gathering wild plants, berries, and roots from the steppe, whatever she could find, sustaining them through conditions that would have killed most people. She maintained the family's dignity and coherence through years of desperate poverty and danger, instilling in her children a set of values: the supreme importance of loyalty, the treachery of abandonment, the necessity of strength, that are directly visible in the adult Genghis Khan's leadership philosophy. Temujin's earliest experiences of betrayal, survival, and the absolute importance of personal loyalty were all shaped by these years under his mother's fierce and loving care. The Mongol military's approach to the siege of fortified cities evolved dramatically over the course of the empire's history, beginning with a profound weakness and ending with one of the most sophisticated siege capabilities in the medieval world. In the early campaigns, before the incorporation of Chinese and Central Asian engineers, the Mongol army had essentially no effective siege capability at all. Their strength was speed and archery on open ground, and walls were an almost insuperable obstacle. Genghis Khan's response to this limitation was characteristically pragmatic. He avoided assaulting strongly fortified positions directly, preferred to draw defenders out with feigned retreats and threats to their supply lines, and when cities had to be taken, relied on blockade, stratagem, and the terrifying power of his reputation to induce surrender before the question of wall assault arose. Over time, as the empire grew and incorporated conquered engineering expertise, this limitation was progressively eliminated. By the time of Kublai Khan's campaigns in southern China in the 1270s, the Mongol siege corps could deploy counterweight trebuchets capable of hurling 300-pound stones with devastating accuracy, weapons that could reduce any fortification of the era to rubble given enough time. The Mongol warrior's training in the use of the lasso, the urga, is one of the most overlooked and fascinating elements of his martial toolkit. On the open steppe, the urga was primarily a herding tool, a long pole with a loop at the end, used to capture and control horses and cattle. But in battle, it became a weapon of remarkable versatility. A skilled warrior could use the urga to unseat enemy riders from distances that put the warrior himself outside effective sword range, could drag infantry soldiers off their feet, could capture prisoners alive when the mission demanded live captives, and could even use it to pull down the scaling ladders of enemy soldiers attempting to storm a defensive position. The training required to use the urga effectively from horseback was identical to the herding practice that Mongol children engaged in from early childhood. Another example of the seamless integration of the Mongol warrior's daily life and military training. The skills of the herdsman were the skills of the soldier, expressed in different contexts but drawing from the same deep reservoir of physical competence. The Black Death, the catastrophic pandemic that killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population in the mid-14th century, has a direct and disturbing connection to the Mongol Empire, though the precise nature of the connection is still debated among historians and epidemiologists. The plague bacterium Yersinia pestis, which causes bubonic and pneumonic plague, was endemic in the rodent populations of Central Asian steppes, the very environment where the Mongol Empire was centered. The rapid movement of Mongol armies across the Eurasian continent, their trade routes connecting previously isolated populations, their siege tactics that concentrated huge numbers of people in close proximity with failing sanitation, and the specific catapulting of plague-infected corpses into besieged cities. All of these factors likely contributed to the spread of plague from its natural reservoir in Central Asian rodents to new human populations across the continent. The Pax Mongolica, which created unprecedented connectivity across Eurasia and was generally beneficial for trade and cultural exchange, was also, in a terrible irony, the vector for the greatest biological catastrophe in human history. The strategic relationship between Genghis Khan and the brilliant General Jebe illuminates one of the most distinctive and admirable aspects of Mongol military culture: the ability to recognize and utilize exceptional talent regardless of its source. Jebe had been an enemy, a warrior from a clan that had fought against Genghis Khan's forces, and the man who had shot Temujin's horse out from under him in battle. When Jebe was captured and brought before Genghis Khan, he could easily have been executed. Instead, Genghis Khan asked him directly, "Was it you who shot my horse?" Jib said yes. And rather than being angry, Genghis Khan was delighted by the honesty and by the obvious skill. He made Jib one of his generals, eventually one of his most trusted army commanders. Together with Subutai, Jib led the extraordinary reconnaissance expedition around the Caspian Sea between 1221 and 1224, covering thousands of miles through Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, the Crimea, and the Russian steppe, defeating every force that stood in their path, and returning with intelligence that would eventually enable the planning of the Great Western Invasion of 1241. It was, by any measure, one of the greatest cavalry operations in history. The infrastructure of the Mongol Empire, at its height in the mid-13th century, was more extensive and more efficiently managed than that of almost any other contemporary state. The Yam postal system has already been discussed, but it was accompanied by a broader network of roads, bridges, caravanserais, and administrative outposts that gave the empire a physical coherence that its geographic scale might seem to make impossible. Roads were maintained across the Mongolian heartland and the most heavily traveled routes of the empire. Bridges, some of them engineering achievements of considerable skill, crossed the major rivers. Official travelers were provided with lodging, food, and remounts at regular intervals. The administrative system, drawing on the expertise of Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian bureaucrats, tracked tax revenues, census data, trade flows, and military logistics across the entire empire. This bureaucratic infrastructure was not built by Genghis Khan himself. He was primarily a military leader, but by his son Ogdi, who had the organizational genius to understand that military conquest alone was not enough and that an empire had to be administered as well as one. The role of shamanism in Mongol military decision-making is one of the most fascinating and least understood aspects of the empire's history. Genghis Khan consulted shamans, before major campaigns and is recorded to have retreated to the mountain of Burkhan Khaldun to pray to Tingri, the sky god, for days before undertaking his most important military operations. The shaman Tingri, also known as Kakachu, was one of the most powerful figures in early Mongol politics, serving as a bridge between the human and divine worlds and conferring or withdrawing spiritual legitimacy from political decisions. But Tingri grew too powerful, eventually claiming divine authority that challenged Genghis Khan's own, and was executed, reportedly by being dragged into a tent by appointed warriors and having his back broken, so that he died without blood being shed. The episode reveals the complex relationship between military power and spiritual authority in Mongol society. Shamanism was genuinely believed and genuinely important, but it could not be allowed to override the political authority of the Khan. When the two came into conflict, the military won. The extraordinary account of the Mongol general Subutai's campaign in Russia between 1236 and 1242 reads, when examined in its strategic totality, less like the operations of a medieval army and more like the maneuver warfare theory that would be developed by military thinkers 6 or 7 centuries later. In the winter of 1237, Mongol forces under Batu Khan and Subutai crossed the Volga River in conditions that would have made winter campaigning unthinkable for any other medieval army and began the systematic destruction of the Russian principalities. Cities fell in rapid succession: Ryazan, Vladimir, Suzdal, Torzhok, each taken within days of investment by a force that moved across the frozen Russian landscape with a speed that the defenders found incomprehensible. The key to this winter campaign was precisely the quality that was the Mongol horse's greatest advantage: its ability to subsist on frozen grass uncovered by its own hooves and to function in temperatures that were catastrophic for the larger, grain-fed European warhorses. The Mongol army moved fastest when conditions were hardest, a strategic paradox that repeatedly confounded their enemies. The question of how many people died as a result of the Mongol conquests is one of the most historically and morally significant questions in the study of the empire, and the numbers, when examined seriously, are almost impossible to absorb. Modern demographic historians, working from comparative population studies of regions before and after conquest, estimate that the Mongol wars of the 13th century killed somewhere between 30 and 40 million people. Some estimates go higher. This figure, in the context of a global population that was perhaps a quarter of today's, represents a proportional toll that has no parallel in human history except possibly the Black Death. Entire regions, the Khwarezmian heartland, large parts of northern China, major sections of the Russian steppe, experienced population collapses of 50 to 75% in the immediate wake of conquest. Cities that had been among the most populous in the world were reduced to ruins that took generations to repopulate. The Mongol conquests were, in terms of lives destroyed relative to global population, the single most lethal series of events in human history before the 20th century. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan who became the ruler of China and the nominal Great Khan of the empire, represents one of the most complex figures in Mongol history and one of the most challenging for the Mongol warrior tradition. Kublai was far more interested in being a Chinese emperor than a steppe warrior. He built the great capital of Dadu, modern Beijing, in the Chinese style, patronized Chinese art and scholarship, converted to Tibetan Buddhism, and surrounded himself with Chinese advisors and administrators. Mongol traditionalists viewed this with profound suspicion and outright hostility, seeing it as a betrayal of the warrior values and the nomadic lifestyle that were the foundation of Mongol identity. But Kublai understood something that the traditionalists resisted. Governing a sedentary civilization of hundreds of millions of people required the adoption of sedentary administrative practices. The steppe warrior ethos was supreme for conquest. It was insufficient for governance. Kublai's attempt to reconcile these two worlds, with mixed success, was one of the defining tensions of the late Mongol era. The Mongol arban, the basic unit of 10 warriors, was the fundamental social and military unit of the army, and its importance extended far beyond its tactical function. The 10 men of an arban lived together, ate together, fought together, and were responsible for each other in a system of collective accountability that created bonds of loyalty at the ground level of the military that were as powerful as any force the empire possessed. If one man of an arban fled in battle, all 10 could be executed. If one man committed a serious crime, the punishment was shared. This extreme version of collective responsibility created an environment of intense mutual surveillance and mutual support. Each warrior was watched over by 9 others and in turn watched over 9 others. The system was brutal, but it worked. Desertion rates in the Mongol army were remarkably low given the extreme conditions of the campaigns, because the personal consequences of desertion extended not just to the individual but to the 9 men he would be abandoning. The loyalty enforced by collective punishment became, over time, genuine loyalty born from shared experience and shared survival. The Mongol tradition of wrestling, bok, deserves deeper examination as a military training system, because its role in preparing warriors for combat was far more sophisticated than the simple development of strength and technique that might be assumed. Mongol wrestling is a grappling art with very few restrictions, unlike the wrestling traditions of many other cultures, which restrict holds above or below the waist, or limit the competition area. Mongol wrestling allows almost any grip anywhere on the body and continues until one competitor's knee, elbow, back, or head touches the ground. This relatively unrestricted format means that Mongol wrestlers develop a complete picture of how the human body can be controlled and unbalanced in combat, including the application of sudden explosive force to joints, the use of leverage against an opponent who is trying to do the same thing, and the ability to remain balanced and functional while being aggressively attacked. For a warrior in hand-to-hand combat, these skills were as important as swordsmanship, perhaps more so in the chaos of a melee, where there was often no room to swing a weapon and the fight came down to who could control the other person's body most effectively. The Mongol Empire's relationship with the papacy and with European Christianity is one of the more bizarre diplomatic episodes of the medieval world and illuminates the profound mutual incomprehension that characterized early Mongol-European contact. Pope Innocent IV, deeply alarmed by the Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe in 1241, sent a series of Franciscan friars eastward as diplomatic envoys in the 1240s, carrying letters that attempted to persuade the Mongol rulers to convert to Christianity, cease their attacks, and explain themselves. The most famous of these missions was led by Giovanni de Piene del Carpine, who traveled to the court of the great Khan Gaiuk in 1246 and returned to Europe 2 years later with a letter from Gaiuk to the Pope that stands as one of the most extraordinary documents in diplomatic history. Gaiuk's letter informed the Pope, in essentially polite but absolutely clear language, that God had already given dominion over the entire earth to the Mongols, and that if the Pope wished to have peace, he should come personally to the Mongol court to submit. The letter also pointed out, with devastating logic, that if the Mongols were truly as evil as the Pope believed, surely God would not have allowed them to conquer half the world. The Mongol warrior's most powerful psychological asset may have been something that has nothing to do with archery or tactics or horses: the consciousness of an unbroken record of victory. By the time of the great campaigns of the 1220s and 1230s, the Mongol army had essentially never lost a major engagement in the field. Warriors who had grown up and trained in this tradition of invincibility carried into battle a psychological surety, a bedrock certainty that they would win, that is one of the most powerful force multipliers in military history. The opposite was equally true for their opponents. An army that has heard for years that the Mongols have never been beaten, that has perhaps seen the smoking ruins of cities that tried to resist and failed, that knows that no previous attempt to stop them has succeeded, that army is already half defeated before the first arrow is fired. The Mongols understood this dynamic perfectly and cultivated it deliberately, through the careful management of their reputation, through the deliberate, theatrical nature of their rewards and punishments, and through the yam-speed communication of their victories across the empire. The Song dynasty in southern China, which survived the fall of northern China to the Mongols by more than 40 years, represents the most sustained resistance any civilization mounted against the Mongol conquest. Protected by the rice paddies, rivers, and dense forests of southern China, terrain that was dramatically hostile to the cavalry-based Mongol military doctrine, the Song managed to survive initial Mongol pressure and maintain independence until 1279. The campaigns to subdue southern China required the Mongol military to reinvent itself once again, developing a riverine and naval capability it had never needed before, incorporating Song Chinese defectors and their knowledge of the terrain, and solving logistical problems that had no precedent in the steppe military tradition. The final collapse of the Song came not from a single decisive battle on land but from the naval battle of Yamen in 1279, at which a Mongol-commanded fleet destroyed the last Song naval forces. The last Song emperor, a 7-year-old child, was taken into the sea by a loyal minister who jumped overboard with him rather than allow the dynasty to be taken captive. The Mongol conquest of China was complete. The extraordinary cultural efflorescence of the Mongol courts, particularly the courts of the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Yuan dynasty in China, is one of the great paradoxes of the empire. The people who had killed more and destroyed more in the history of the world also presided over some of the greatest cross-cultural artistic and intellectual achievements of the medieval era. Persian miniature painting reached a new level of sophistication under Ilkhanid patronage, incorporating Chinese visual elements brought by Mongol-facilitated contact with the East. Chinese porcelain techniques spread westward through Mongol trade routes, eventually influencing the ceramics traditions of Persia, Turkey, and Europe. Medical knowledge from Arabic and Persian physicians spread eastward to China, and Chinese medical knowledge spread westward. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge flowed in both directions. The great astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, patronized by Hulagu Khan despite the devastation of the Mongol conquest, built the Maraga Observatory in modern Iran and produced astronomical tables of extraordinary accuracy that influenced both Islamic and European astronomy for centuries. Destruction and creation in the Mongol story are not opposites. They are elements of the same violent, transformative process. The Golden Horde, the western successor state of the Mongol Empire, established in the steppes north of the Black Sea and the Caspian, represents one of the longest-lived and most consequential of the post-Genghis Mongol polities, and its relationship with the Russian principalities shaped the development of Russia in ways that historians argue about to this day. For approximately 2.5 centuries, from the 1240s to the late 15th century, the Russian principalities paid tribute to the Golden Horde, sent their princes to receive the Mongol Yarlik, the patent of authority, before they could legitimately rule, and organize their economies and their administrative systems around the requirements of Mongol overlordship. The exact nature of the Mongol impact on Russian development remains intensely debated. Some historians see the long period of Mongol domination as a catastrophic interruption that set Russia apart from the Western European development trajectory. Others argue that Russian administrative traditions, particularly the centralized autocratic state model, were deeply influenced by the Mongol system of governance. And others suggest that the Mongol period was primarily destructive and that Russia's subsequent development represented a recovery from catastrophe rather than a synthesis with Mongol tradition. The story of the Assassins, the Nizari Ismaili order based in the mountain fortresses of Persia and Syria, one of the most formidable and feared organizations in the medieval Islamic world, and their encounter with the Mongols is one of the great dramatic set pieces of the 13th century. The Assassins had maintained their independence for nearly 2 centuries by their combination of near-impregnable mountain fortresses, political assassination as a strategic tool, and a reputation for absolutely fanatical commitment to their cause that made most rulers reluctant to directly confront them. Against the Mongols, none of these advantages were sufficient. Hulagu Khan, sent by his brother Monk Khan to complete the conquest of the Islamic world, reduced the assassin strongholds one by one through a combination of siege, negotiation, and the systematic destruction of the irrigation systems that the mountain fortresses depended on for their agricultural support. The last Grand Master of the Assassins, Rukn al-Din Kursha, surrendered in 1256 and was taken to the Mongol court, where he was eventually killed. The Great Library of Alamut, one of the most extraordinary collections of manuscripts in the medieval world, was reportedly destroyed during the conquest, though some sources suggest that Hulagu salvaged at least some of its astronomical and mathematical manuscripts for his patronage of the Maraga Observatory. The descendants of Genghis Khan, the Chinggisids, as historians call them, ruled different parts of the former empire for centuries after the main period of conquest, and their political authority derived entirely from the fact of their descent from the founder. To be a legitimate ruler in the Mongol tradition, you had to be a direct male descendant of Genghis Khan. This was not merely a convention but an absolute principle, so deeply embedded in Mongol political culture that even rulers of enormous practical power sought Chinggisid princes to legitimize their authority. This principle created a remarkable political dynamic in the successor states. As the Mongol ruling families intermarried with local populations, converted to local religions, and adopted local cultural practices, they increasingly ceased to be Mongol in any meaningful cultural sense, but they retained their claim to authority through the bloodline. The last Chinggisid rulers were still citing their descent from Genghis Khan as the basis of their legitimacy in the 18th and even early 19th centuries, 500 years after the death of the man from whose union with the sky the entire political tradition flowed. The concept of Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, describes the period of roughly 100 years, from the mid-13th to the mid-14th century, during which the Mongol Empire's control of the Silk Road created conditions for unprecedented long-distance trade and cultural exchange across Eurasia. Merchants could travel from the Pacific coast of China to the Mediterranean with a single guarantee of safe passage, protected by the Pesa and by the infrastructure of the Yam. The volume of goods flowing along these routes, silk, spices, porcelain, gold, horses, cotton, glass, precious stones, furs, was greater than at any previous point in history. Ideas traveled with the goods. Mathematical concepts, medical knowledge, astronomical observations, religious texts, artistic techniques, architectural styles. The Chinese invention of printing with movable type, which had existed in China for centuries, may have traveled westward along Mongol-maintained trade routes to eventually influence the development of Gutenberg's printing press in Europe, though this remains speculative. The Black Death that ended the Pax Mongolica traveled along the same routes as the Silk. The great connectivity that made the Mongol peace so productive was also the mechanism of the most devastating epidemic in human history. The Mongol military's use of prisoners of war was one of the most coldly efficient aspects of a military system that was efficient in all its aspects. Captured enemy soldiers who were skilled in any militarily useful art, siege engineering, artillery operation, horsemanship training, weapons manufacture, were typically integrated directly into the Mongol force and put to work doing what they did best, now in service of their conquerors. Prisoners without useful specialized skills but with physical strength and endurance were sometimes organized into human shield formations called kashar, groups of captured civilians or soldiers who were driven ahead of the main Mongol force toward enemy defenses, absorbing the first arrows and bolts from defending archers and reducing the cost in Mongol lives of advancing to assault range. The use of kashar was one of the most morally disturbing aspects of Mongol siege warfare, a deliberate weaponization of the innocent and the captured that makes clear how comprehensively the Mongols were willing to subordinate every consideration to the achievement of military objectives. The environmental history of the Mongol Empire is a dimension of its story that has only recently begun to receive the attention it deserves from historians. The great conquests created ecological changes that were as significant as their political ones. The depopulation of large agricultural regions, where the destruction of irrigation systems and the massacre or displacement of farming populations allowed the land to revert to steppe or scrub, actually expanded the grazing territory available for Mongol horse herds, which in turn supported continued military expansion. Climate historians have noted that the early 13th century experienced a period of unusual warmth and rainfall in the Mongolian steppe, conditions that would have dramatically increased grass productivity and, by extension, horse populations, potentially providing the demographic and logistic foundation for the military expansion that Genghis Khan launched. If this analysis is correct, the Mongol conquests were partly enabled by a favorable climatic moment, a window of ecological advantage that the Mongols were brilliant enough and organized enough to exploit to its absolute maximum. The training that Mongol warriors received in the tracking and interpretation of signs, animal tracks, weather patterns, the behavior of birds, the condition of water sources, was not merely a survival skill but a form of military intelligence gathering that was deeply integrated into operational practice. A warrior who could read the signs of recent human passage across the steppe, who could determine from the tracks of horses whether they were carrying loaded cargo or moving freely, who could tell from the behavior of birds whether a force was concealed in a valley ahead, who could judge from the freshness of animal dung how recently a camp had been occupied. Such a warrior was an intelligence asset of enormous value in an era before satellite imagery and electronic surveillance. Every Mongol warrior was trained in these skills from childhood, and the army as a whole functioned as a vast distributed intelligence-gathering network, with each rider contributing observations that could be rapidly communicated upward through the command structure to inform operational decisions. The final great Mongol campaign in the West, the invasion of the Middle East by Hulagu Khan's Ilkhanate forces in the 1250s and 1260s, ended at the Battle of Ain Jalut not simply because the Mamluks fought brilliantly, though they did, but also because of a confluence of factors that illustrate the empire's growing internal contradictions. Hulagu had been forced to reduce the size of his force in Syria because of political crisis in the east following the death of Mongol Khan. A portion of his army had to be recalled for the Kurultai and for military operations against his Mongol rivals. His remaining force, though still formidable, was smaller than the full Ilkhanate strength. Additionally, the Ilkhanate's Christian allies, the Armenian kingdom and the Crusader states, failed to support the Mongol advance with the forces that had been hoped for. And the Mamluk force under Baybars was operating on home territory, with secure supply lines, full knowledge of the terrain, and the psychological advantage of defending the last major independent Islamic state against what appeared to be an existential threat. All of these factors combined at Ain Jalut to produce the first major Mongol defeat in open battle, a defeat that stopped the westward expansion of the Mongol Empire permanently. The legacy of the Mongol warrior tradition did not end with the fragmentation of the empire. The steppe military tradition that the Mongols had refined continued to influence warfare across Eurasia for centuries after the main period of conquest. The Ottoman cavalry, the Timurid armies, the Mughal forces that conquered India, the Cossack raiders of the Russian steppe, all of them drew in various ways on tactical traditions, weapons technologies, and organizational concepts that had been developed or disseminated by the Mongol military system. Timur the Lame, Tamerlane, who devastated Central Asia, Persia, India, and the Ottoman Empire in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, explicitly modeled himself on Genghis Khan and employed a military system that was in many respects a direct inheritance of Mongol practice. The Mongol Empire, founded in India by Babur, was a Chinggis-Timurid synthesis that ruled one of the world's most populous and wealthy regions for 3 centuries. The Mongol military tradition, in other words, did not die when the original empire fragmented. It evolved, multiplied, and continued reshaping the world for generations. The personal weapons of a senior Mongol commander were objects of extraordinary craftsmanship and deep symbolic significance, representing in physical form the martial and spiritual identity of the man who carried them. A great general's saber was typically made from the finest steel available, Damascus steel or its Central Asian equivalent, with a handle and scabbard decorated with gold, silver, and precious stones that indicated the owner's rank and accomplishments. His bow was similarly decorated and was often the product of years of careful construction by a master bowyer who had tuned every element of its construction for the specific draw weight and shooting style of its owner. These weapons were not primarily status symbols. They were working tools of the highest quality, but they also carried a ceremonial dimension that reflected the Mongol understanding of weapons as extensions of the warrior's identity. When a great warrior died, his weapons were buried with him. When a warrior was disgraced, his weapons were confiscated. When a new warrior was elevated to high command, he was presented with weapons by the Khan himself, a gesture that transferred authority as much as it provided armament. The extraordinary episode of the Mongol conquest of the Western Xia Kingdom, the Tangut state that occupied the territory of modern-day Gansu and Ningxia in northwestern China, illustrates the most persistent and personal of Genghis Khan's military campaigns. The Western Xia had been one of the first major targets of the Mongol expansion and had submitted to Mongol authority, but they repeatedly failed to provide the military assistance that their vassal status required. When, in 1219, the Western Xia declined to provide forces for the Khwarezmian campaign, Genghis Khan is reported to have said that this refusal would cost them everything when he returned. And return he did, in 1226, leading what would be his final campaign in person. The conquest was proceeding with characteristic Mongol efficiency when Genghis Khan died, in 1227, before the final reduction of the Western Xia capital was complete. His death was concealed from the army, reportedly by continuing to conduct normal military business and movement, pretending the Khan was merely ill until the campaign was completed. The Western Xia capital fell, the royal family was killed, and only then was the death of Genghis Khan officially announced to the empire. His last campaign was completed posthumously, in fulfillment of his personal oath. The modern nation of Mongolia carries the legacy of the Mongol warrior tradition in ways both profound and sometimes surprising. Mongolian national identity is deeply intertwined with the figure of Genghis Khan, not the terrifying destroyer of cities known to the descendants of his victims across Eurasia, but the great unifier, the lawgiver, the genius who took a fragmented collection of tribes and forged them into a force that changed the world. His face appears on Mongolian currency. The largest airport in Ulaanbaatar bears his name. Statues of him stand across the country, and the greatest, a gleaming steel equestrian colossus at Sanjin Bulldog, east of the capital, is visible for miles across the steppe, a figure on horseback pointing eastward, toward the rising sun, toward the direction from which the great man came. The 3 manly sports of wrestling, archery, and horsemanship, the warrior skills that were the foundation of the Mongol military, are still practiced and celebrated at Naadam, the national festival, every July. And the Mongolian language, written in the classical Mongolian script that Genghis Khan commissioned from captured Uyghur scholars in 1204, preserves a direct connection to the world of the warrior empire in its very letters and sounds. The intelligence and adaptability of the Mongol military system is perhaps most powerfully illustrated by its treatment of failure and innovation. Most military systems of the medieval era were deeply conservative. Changes in tactics, weapons, or organization happened slowly, reluctantly, and against enormous institutional resistance. The Mongol system was the opposite. When an approach failed, when a siege technique proved ineffective, when a cavalry maneuver was anticipated and countered, when the terrain of a new region demanded different methods, the response was rapid adaptation rather than insistence on tradition. Genghis Khan himself modeled this attitude, demonstrating a willingness to learn from every enemy he encountered that was as remarkable as his raw military gifts. His adoption of siege engineering from conquered Chinese and Persian experts was one example. His development of the intelligence and logistical infrastructure of the empire reflected lessons learned from the limitations of the early campaigns. His eventual formalization of the feigned retreat, the Nurj, and the Tumun system all represent adaptations refined through experience rather than doctrines handed down from tradition. The Mongol army was, in the deepest sense, a learning organization. The role of the Mongol archer in shape charge formation fire, the coordinated volley that could saturate a target area with arrows faster than any individual archery could achieve, was one of the most lethal tactical techniques in the Mongol arsenal and one that required exactly the kind of unit discipline and coordination that the decimal system was designed to produce. Rather than having each warrior select his own targets and fire individually, a unit of Mongol archers would often fire in coordinated volleys directed by officer commands, all arrows aimed at the same zone, released at the same moment, creating a density of projectiles in the air that no formation of armored soldiers could withstand without catastrophic losses. This technique was particularly effective against the tightly packed formations that European and Chinese armies typically adopted. The more disciplined and cohesive the enemy formation, the more catastrophic the effect of concentrated arrow fire on it. And when the enemy spread out to reduce the density of fire, they became vulnerable to the cavalry charge that was always waiting at the edge of effective arrow range. The Mongol warriors' understanding of geography was extraordinary for the pre-cartographic era and was one of the foundations of the empire's operational success. Genghis Khan and his generals maintained mental maps of operational theaters of stunning complexity and accuracy, built from the reports of scouts, the accounts of merchants, and the personal reconnaissance of commanders who had traveled the routes themselves. When Subutai planned the invasion of Eastern Europe in 1241, he had been there before. The reconnaissance campaign of 1221 to 1224 had given him personal knowledge of the terrain, the rivers, the mountain passes, the roads, and the political landscape of the region that no other military commander of the era possessed. His invasion routes in 1241 exploited exactly the geographic and political weaknesses he had identified 17 years earlier. This combination of systematic intelligence gathering and long-term operational patience gave the Mongol military a planning capability that was genuinely unique in the medieval world and that explains many of the otherwise mysterious aspects of their campaign timing and route selection. Perhaps the most lasting and least appreciated legacy of the Mongol warrior tradition is its contribution to the concept of universal law and global governance. The Yasa, Genghis Khan's law code, was one of the first attempts in history to establish a uniform legal framework that applied across different cultures, religions, and ethnic groups. The Mongol Empire's formal policy of religious tolerance, its protection of merchants and travelers, its standardized weights and measures for trade, its diplomatic conventions and ambassador protections, all of these were elements of a proto-international order that had no precedent at the scale at which it was applied. Scholars have debated whether the Mongol imperial system influenced the later development of international law and global governance concepts, and the direct connections are difficult to establish with certainty. But the basic insight, that a large, diverse, multi-ethnic empire required a uniform framework of law and protection to function, is one that the Mongols understood and implemented before anyone else in history did so at this scale. The Mongol tradition of the Great Kurultai, the assembly of all senior Mongol nobles and commanders at which the most important political decisions were made, represents one of the most fascinating political institutions of the medieval world and deserves more attention than it typically receives in popular accounts of the empire. The Kurultai was not a rubber stamp body. The Great Assembly at which Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan in approximately 1206 was a genuine political event at which the assembled nobles conferred authority on the Khan by unanimous acclamation, and that acclamation, in Mongol political theory, was what made the authority legitimate. The selection of a new Great Khan after the death of the previous one required a Kurultai at which all eligible candidates and their supporters could make their case, at which alliances were built and tested, and at which the assembled nobles eventually achieved, or were pressured into, a consensus. These assemblies could last for months and could be accompanied by political maneuvering of extraordinary complexity and occasional violence. The Mongol Empire, for all its military authoritarianism, was in its highest political decisions a form of aristocratic republic. The Khan's authority was real and absolute in most respects, but it derived from a collective political act and could not be transferred without another one. The world that the Mongol warrior helped create was not, in the end, simply a world of conquest and destruction. It was a world of connection, a world in which ideas, technologies, diseases, and people moved across the face of Eurasia with a speed and volume that had never been seen before. The Mongol Empire was the first globalized world system, the first instance of what we would today recognize as a world order, imperfect, violent, exploitative, but real. And the warriors who built it, the horsemen of the steppe, the archers on their little shaggy ponies, the generals who planned invasions across thousands of miles of unknown territory, were not simply destroyers. They were the architects of the first connected world, agents of a transformation so radical and so rapid that the civilizations it swept up in its path had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. We are still, in ways we do not always recognize, living in the world that the Mongol warriors made. And now, at the end of this account, this long ride across the steppe of history, it is worth pausing to reflect on what the story of the Mongol warriors actually means for us, sitting here centuries later, in a world that still bears the imprint of their passage. They were, by any objective measure, extraordinary human beings, physically gifted, tactically brilliant, strategically imaginative, organizationally sophisticated, and possessed of a will to succeed that bent the entire arc of human history. They were also, by any objective measure, responsible for some of the greatest human suffering ever inflicted in a concentrated period of time. These two things are simultaneously true, and neither cancels the other out. History does not sort neatly into heroes and villains, into stories of pure achievement or pure catastrophe. The Mongol warrior tradition is one of the most powerful illustrations of this truth that history offers, a story of genius and brutality, of creation and destruction, of connection and annihilation, all bound together in the figure of a horseman on the steppe, riding hard toward the horizon, with the fate of the world under his horse's hooves. If this journey through the world of the Mongol warriors has lit something in you, a spark of curiosity, a hunger to understand more about the forces that shaped the world we inhabit, then let that spark lead you further. History is the most inexhaustible subject in human experience, and every story you find in it connects to a dozen others waiting to be discovered. If you found value in this account, share it with someone who loves history as much as you do. And if you want more stories, more forgotten truths, more moments that change the way you see the world, then stay with us. The horizon is always full of stories. And the ride is just beginning.